Preamble is the part of the Constitution that best reflects the constitutional understandings of the framers. It is a key to unlock the minds of those who drafted this Constitution. Its terms thus have far-reaching social implications. Let's understand the major key terms in the Preamble and study their true meaning. First, let's study the term sovereign. The term sovereignty refers to the ultimate authority that oversees the decision-making process of the state. It's closely related to the concept of a state, its independence, and democracy. Sovereignty is a term that is used to refer to the independence and autonomy of modern nation-states. Unlike earlier eras, where countries were ruled by kings in historic times, and by colonial powers in the 18th and the 19th centuries, sovereignty refers to the fact of absolute independence and autonomy that nation states have with respect to the decisions taken by them in matters concerning their citizenry. Sovereignty means that nation states are free to decide for themselves about the kind of democracy that they want, the kind of representatives that they want in parliament, and their policies internally and externally. Sovereign nations are expected to be autonomous and independent when they pursue policies that are in their interest and their people's interest, and not according to the dictates of a foreign power. Thus, India being a sovereign nation implies that it is neither a dependency nor a dominion of any other nation and is an independent country. Next key term, democratic. Let's study the term in detail. The word democracy comes from the Greek words demos, meaning people, and kratos, meaning power or rule. Thus, democracy translates to the rule of the people. It's a system of government that bases its legitimacy on the participation of the people. In this context, Abraham Lincoln's definition of democracy perfectly sums up the argument. He said, democracy is a government of the people, by the people, and for the people. Democracies come in different shapes and sizes. They can be direct or indirect, constitutional or unconstitutional, federal or unitary, presidential or parliamentary. If democracies can exist in so many forms, then what kind of democracy do you think was envisaged by the makers of our Constitution? Well, let's find out. India is an indirect democracy. It means that we have a form of government in which representatives are elected to make policy and enforce laws while representing the citizens. India is also a constitutional democracy. It means that we have a system of government based on popular sovereignty, in which the structures, powers, and limits of government are predefined in the Constitution. Furthermore, India is a federal democracy. It implies that we have a system of government in which power is constitutionally divided between a central governing authority and the constituent political units, like states. And last but not the least, India is a parliamentary democracy. It implies that the political power is vested with the elected legislature, parliament, that in turn chooses the executive, the prime minister, and the ministers. Republic. The term republic represents a form of government in which the head of the state is an elected person and not a hereditary monarch. Under such a system, political sovereignty is vested with the people, and the head of the state is a person elected by the people for a fixed term. Thus, India is a republic, not because the head of the state is chosen by birthright, but because the head of the state, that is the President of India, is elected by the people. Although indirectly, but this president holds office for a fixed term of 5 years. Socialism relates to the ideal of equality, as everyone is entitled to equal opportunities and equal access to resources, by removing wealth disparities and unemployment. It embraces democracy as everyone is equally entitled to participate in the decision-making process, in their lives, and in the governmental institutions. It stresses on the importance of individual freedom by protecting individual liberties. Lastly, it stresses on the importance of community and collective well-being. Let me elaborate with the help of an example. Consider yourself to be living in a purely socialist state. The chances are that you might be a government employee, earning wages fixed by the government. If your income is taxed, the extent of taxes to your disposable income might be fixed by the government. It is highly likely that your rations and other essentials might be delivered from a government distribution center at prices fixed by the government. You might own no land or property, as it is all owned by the government. Sounds fascinating, right? Just count the number of times you heard the term government. Well, that is the essence of socialism. In short, the government controls every aspect of income, production, distribution, and employment in order to ensure equitable distribution of resources. The supporters of socialism argue that the government should be involved in the production and distribution of goods and services to establish an egalitarian society. On the other hand, the critiques of socialism argue that it leads to inefficiency, it leads to corruption. Well, there is some merit to both arguments, and I'll explain why. The rise of socialism in modern times is rooted in the drawbacks of capitalism. The prevalence of capitalism in the Western European countries and the United States led to large-scale urbanization, industrialization, and economic growth. But at the same time, it magnified income disparities between the haves and have-nots, leading to the proliferation of slums and high-rise buildings at the same time. It is in this backdrop that socialism, or say communism, emerged, courtesy Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels. This populist economic construct that was called socialism stressed on centralized planning and collective ownership of resources for the public good. The countries in Eastern Europe, China, Cuba, and USSR, before it was disintegrated, practiced socialism but failed immensely. The disintegration of USSR was a turning point. It led to the fall of socialism and the emergence of a different form of socialism. It was called democratic socialism. Here the private sector plays a more important role and the private ownership of resources is allowed. However, the government's role to establish an egalitarian society remained unchanged. Like many countries in the modern world, India practices this form of socialism. The mention of the term socialism also refers to the same, that is, democratic socialism. As we can see, there are different types of socialism, such as Marxian socialism and Fabian socialism. Indian socialism is a blend of Marxism and Gandhism, leading heavily towards Gandhian socialism. If that is the case, then why did the makers of our constitution choose not to include the term in the preamble in 1949? The answer to that question lies in the Constituent Assembly debates. The term socialist was one of the 3 terms inserted through the 42nd Constitutional Amendment Act in 1976. Professor K.T. Shah moved the amendment to insert secular, federal, socialist in the text of the preamble. Dr. Ambedkar was opposed to the amendment as a whole and called it superfluous. His response specifically explained his unwillingness to incorporate socialist in the preambular text. He said, what should be the policy of the state? How the society should be organized in its social and economic side? These are the matters which must be decided by the people themselves. according to time and circumstances. It cannot be laid down in the Constitution itself, because that is destroying democracy altogether. If you state in the Constitution that the social organization of the state shall take a particular form, you are, in my judgment, taking away the liberty of the people to decide what should be the social organization in which they wish to live. It's perfectly possible today for the majority of the people to hold that socialist organization of society is better than the capitalist organization of society. But it would be perfectly possible for thinking people to devise some other form of social organization which might be better than socialist organization of today or of tomorrow. Dr. Ambedkar's response to Professor K.T. Shah's amendment perfectly sums it up. The makers of our constitution felt that the spirit of socialism was already imbibed in certain provisions of the fundamental rights and directive principles of state policy. In doing so, the Assembly was giving a socialist direction to Indian polity, while also not dictating terms to it. This was in sync with the decision of the Indian National Congress in its Awadhi session in 1955, which called for the establishment of socialistic pattern of society. Regardless, the term socialism was inserted into the Preamble in the 42nd Constitutional Amendment Act in 1976. However, an imploding economic crisis in 1991 led to the further liberalization of the economy through a spate of reforms that were called LPG reforms: liberalization, privatization, globalization. These reforms constrained the government's power to intervene in the market. The government's control and ownership over its public sector enterprises was reduced, and the policies allowed for greater foreign investment in strategic sectors. Thus, the 1991 LPG reforms weakened the socialistic ideals of the Constitution that is also enshrined in the Preamble. Secular. It was also added through the 42nd Constitutional Amendment Act in 1976. However, the story behind it is not only unique but also intriguing. Want to know more? Well, let's find out. The story begins in 1947. The large-scale communal riots witnessed in several parts of India. During, before, and after the partition left the makers of our constitution with bitter memories. They were determined to prevent the harrowing experiences witnessed during the partition. Thus, some members of the Constituent Assembly, especially Brajeshwar Prasad and Professor K.T. Shah, wanted the inclusion of the term secular in the preamble. However, all motions to include the term secular were rejected, not because the members rejected the idea of secularism, but were concerned about the usage of the term in India's context. Allow me to elaborate. The literal meaning of the term secularism meant separation of religion from the social, political, economic, and cultural affairs of life. That is, religious groups don't interfere in the affairs of state, and the state doesn't interfere in religious affairs. It meant that individuals had the freedom to practice the religion of their choice or even be an atheist, but that didn't put them at a disadvantage for accessing public services. However, in India's context, this form of secularism was non-viable as the makers of our constitution wanted to protect the rights of religious minorities, and religion was an inseparable part of people's lives in India. K. Munshi's words perfectly sums up. He said, "We are a people with deeply religious moorings. At the same time, we have a living tradition of religious tolerance." The results of the broad outlook of Hinduism, that all the religions lead to the same God. In view of this situation, our state could not possibly have a state religion, nor could a rigid line be drawn between the state and the church as in the United States. Nevertheless, there is one particular aspect of secularism that each and every member of the Constituent Assembly put forth. It was that the state would endorse no particular religion and would treat all religions as equal. They wanted to be sure that an individual's religious belief or lack thereof didn't put the individual at a disadvantage when compared to others. Thus, the makers of our Constitution included provisions that ensured that all religions were given equal status. And at the same time, they chose not to include the term secular from the preambular text. Even the Supreme Court in 1974 asserted that though the word secular was not inserted in the Constitution, the inclusion of Articles 25 to 28 prove that the makers of the Constitution wanted to establish a secular state. Let's turn our attention to the next key term, justice. On close reading of the preambular text, we can infer that the preamble promises to secure to all its citizens socio-economic and political justice. The makers of our Constitution borrowed this ideal of socio-economic and political justice from the Russian Revolution in 1917. But what do these terms mean? Well, let's examine them. Social justice involves the abolition of all sorts of inequalities which may occur from variations of wealth, chance, status, race, religion, caste, title, and the like. It means that no privileges are extended to any particular section of the society, and the improvement in the conditions of disadvantaged and backward classes, SCs, STs, OBCs, and women. The term social justice has profound meaning in India's context. Before independence, the stratification of society based on caste hugely limited the upward mobility of lower castes. The interplay between the practices of untouchability and the caste system led to huge injustices that were suffered by the marginalized sections of society. Even the inhumane practices of manual scavenging exist today, although the law has abolished it. Next, let's turn our attention to the notion of economic justice. It means that all citizens should have adequate opportunities to earn their livelihood. Economic justice refers to the establishment of a welfare state based on the ideals of mutual aid, social welfare, and redistribution of income. The primary function of a welfare state is to promote national growth and public well-being by providing full employment, social security, and minimum standard of living. The notions of social and economic justice are collectively called distributive justice. It refers to the equitable allocation of resources among the members of a country. The principles of distributive justice tells us how these benefits and burdens ought to be shared among the members of a country. Last but not the least, the preamble talks about securing political justice to all its citizens. The term political justice means giving equal political rights and opportunities to all the citizens to take part in the administration of the country. It implies that all citizens have the right to vote without any discrimination on the basis of caste, sex, religion, etc. It means that citizens have the right to contest elections and have equal access to all public offices. In India, the enforcement of universal adult franchise for citizens in the age group of 18 or above, representative political democracy, conduct of regular elections, and reservations to backward classes have led to some degree of political justice. However, the underrepresentation of religious minorities and women in India's political institutions, criminalization of politics, and lack of participatory democracy implies that to achieve true political justice, India needs to go a long way. Liberty, in its literal sense, refers to the absence of restraints on the activities of individuals and at the same time providing opportunities for the development of individual personalities. It is one of the most important fundamental rights of a man, which affects the freedom of his individuality. Liberty helps us establish a level of intellectual, spiritual, and economic thinking that helps in the development of a state. In a society that respects individual liberties, dissenting opinions and lifestyles are not just tolerated but encouraged. The preamble of the Indian Constitution promises to secure to all its citizens liberty of thought, expression, belief, faith, and worship. Liberty of thought refers to the ability of an individual to freely consider a fact or a viewpoint without hindrance and fear of punishment. It's a precursor to the other liberties. Without liberty of thought, all other liberties are inoperable or non-existent. Next comes liberty of expression. It refers to the ability of an individual to freely express his thoughts and views on any issue through any medium without any hindrance or fear of punishment. And finally, we have liberty of belief, faith, and worship. These liberties give an individual the right to believe, exercise, and act upon his religious conscience without unnecessary interference by the government. It is interesting to note that these liberties also give an individual the choice to not follow or practice any religion. The Constitution affirms the right to freedom of expression, which includes the right to voice one's opinion, the right to seek information and ideas, the right to receive information, and right to impart information. The Indian state is under an obligation to create conditions in which all citizens can effectively and efficiently enjoy these rights. Through the preamble, the makers of our Constitution have included a set of promises that it strives to guarantee to all Indian citizens. One among them is the promise of equality. To be specific, the promise of equality of status and equality of opportunity. Just try to analyze Dr. Ambedkar's response on the prevalence of socio-economic inequalities in India. He said, and I quote, "We must begin by acknowledging the fact that there is a complete absence of two things in Indian society. One of these is equality. On the social plane, we have in India a society based on the principle of graded inequality, which we have a society in which there are some who have immense wealth as against many who live in abject poverty. On the 26th of January 1950, we are going to enter into a life of contradictions. In politics, we have equality, and in social and economic life, we will have inequality. How long shall we continue to live this life of contradictions? How long shall we continue to deny equality in our social and economic lives? If we continue to deny it for long, we will do so only by putting our political democracy in peril. We must remove this contradiction at the earliest possible moment, or else those who suffer from inequality will blow up the structure of political democracy which this assembly has laboriously built up. Reservation is one such tool to address structural inequalities by giving those at the bottom an opportunity to participate in education and employment. This might seem antithetical to the idea of equality, but it is not, because it allows for the first principle of egalitarian society, the equality of opportunity, which has been hitherto denied to certain specific social groups. Therefore, reservation for oppressed groups is a way of both recognizing and redressing structural disparities between persons. This is an example of Indian Constitution's commitment to substantive equality. Thus, equality of status and opportunity mentioned in the preamble lays the ground for three types of equality as mentioned in the Constitution. Civic rights, that is the rights that protect an individual's freedom from infringement by the government. Political rights, that is the right to participate in civil society and politics. Economic rights, that is the right to social security and access to basic necessities. Last comes the ideal of fraternity. The ideals of liberty, equality, and fraternity have been borrowed from the French Constitution. The Constitution promotes this feeling of fraternity by the system of single citizenship and fundamental duties. Fraternity is indicative of a common bond or a feeling of unity between people or communities acting either within the private or public sphere. A fraternal bond is one that does not relate to the shared use of goods, but rather a shared feeling that is intrinsic to the existence and functioning of the agents themselves. As an ideological concept, fraternity emerged during the French Revolution against a totalitarian and absolutist monarch and was accompanied by the claims of liberty and equality. In the Berubari Union case, the Supreme Court held the view that preamble was not a part of the Constitution. But the Supreme Court in Keshavananda Bharti versus State of Kerala reversed its stand regarding the preamble. It said that the preamble was an important part of the Constitution and that it could be used as a legitimate source to interpret the Constitution.